Camille Vallaux begins his analysis by highlighting that, although humanity has greatly expanded its capabilities by mastering the seas, it remains above all a terrestrial species. The ocean for humans is generally seen as a zone for movement and use, for transporting goods, fishing and trade, but rarely as a space for permanent habitation. Human groups that live exclusively from and on the water are very rare and are generally geographically marginalized, like the Eskimos in the Arctic or the inhabitants of small islands in the Pacific. These peoples are, according to Camille Vallaux, extreme cases of humanity forced by geography to subsist almost exclusively on maritime resources. However, limiting the concept of maritime population only to these groups would be insufficient. Camille Vallaux says this because the ocean has come to impose particular living conditions on many people who are not traditionally sailors. On the one hand, man has conquered the sea. On the other hand, the sea has also conquered man. As history progressed, the sea began to play an increasing role in the development of civilizations, especially in the West. Civilization, according to Camille Vallaux, went through successive phases: the fluvial, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and finally, the oceanic. And this increasing penetration of the sea into human life made the conditions of defense and the importance of the place of great importance for the maritime population, the great maritime importance. The sea was of great importance to the maritime population. Vallaux then proposes a more restricted definition of what would be Ecumene, which refers to the inhabited or habitable part of the globe. For a space to be truly considered maritime Ecumene, it is of great importance that a socially structured population maintains a continuous or habitual presence in a coastal region, on an island, or in a permanent fishing zone. This includes, for example, coastlines such as fertile continental shelves, enclosed seas like the Baltic Sea, fishing zones like the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, or densely exploited coastlines like that of Brittany. In these cases, the sea is not just crossed, but it also forms the structure of the ways of life that sustain communities and impose economic rhythms. An example is the region around the English Channel as an example of a densely populated area. Most of the people who pass through there are in transit. They don't live there, they don't settle there, so they don't form a community connected to that space. The English Channel works in this sense as a line of connection between fixed habitats, a corridor, and not a residence. For him, a true ecumene. It is not defined by the density of human presence at the moment, but by its permanence, by repetition, and by the incorporation of geography into daily life. He also distinguishes maritime deserts, which are zones of passage, from terrestrial deserts, where nomadic tribes live in the desert who, although mobile, always live within constant geographic and climatic conditions, which connects them to a fixed environment. In contrast, ships crossing oceans leave and enter entirely different environments, and their stay in a maritime space is minimal, disconnected, dissolved as quickly as it is formed. So he presents his definition of maritime migration. If the sea, as an ecumene, has a relatively limited role, the sea, on the other hand, is a central agent in the circulation of people and the reconfiguration of human groups. He defines migration broadly because any movement of human groups, whether permanent or temporary, that modifies their own cultural environment in his view, is an element of migration. Terrestre é uma migração. Such movements can be peaceful or violent, organized or chaotic, motivated by political empires, by trade, or even by individual impulses. Regardless of its nature, every migratory movement contributes to unbalancing or reorganizing the human map on the planet, creating new groupings that soon tend to be dissolved or transformed again. Vallaux's attempt is to systematize the human geography of humanity, clearly distinguishing between the areas of the sea that are truly inhabited, the ecumenes, those that are merely crossed, and the human flows that circulate over these surfaces. He shows that humanity's relationship with the ocean is multifaceted, that is, it takes place in various ways. Sometimes distant, sometimes intimate, sometimes fixed, sometimes mobile, sometimes marginal, sometimes central in the development of civilizations. He deepens his analysis of maritime migrations, starting by presenting concrete and varied examples to illustrate the complexity and the multiple forms of these human movements. The first and most important case mentioned is the European migration to North America across the Atlantic Ocean. A phenomenon of historical proportions that not only caused a massive population redistribution, but also acted as a true, which Camille Vallaux calls croisée de peuple, that is, a vessel where ethnicities, languages, and social classes merged more quickly than ever occurred in the European continental context. Camille Vallaux mentions how maritime influence accelerates social and historical processes, intensifying contacts and shortening the time needed for collective formations, and at the same time reducing their durability. A common trait of maritime empires is that they emerge and vanish rapidly, according to Camille Vallaux. He also gives the example of temporary and periodic migrations, in this case at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, where he mentions how Italian agricultural workers would alternate between the harvests in the Rio de la Plata region during the austral summer, that is, in the south, and the harvests in Europe during the boreal summer, that is, in the north. This case, he mentions, was a migratory phenomenon called transatlantic circular migration, which especially involved Italians from both the north and south of Italy, who temporarily moved between Europe and South America, more specifically between Argentina and Uruguay, to do seasonal work such as harvesting wheat, grapes, or other crops. These seasonal Italian immigrants were popularly known as swallows, or in Spanish, golondrinas. This nickname was given because, just like the birds, they traveled long distances for the summer and returned in the winter, thus following agricultural job opportunities in South America. This case shows how regular geographic and climatic factors structure constant migratory flows without necessarily creating permanent communities at both points. Migration can be peaceful or violent, organized or spontaneous. In the case of Europe, most of the historical long-distance migrations occurred by force, from the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Great Britain to the attacks against indigenous peoples in Australia and Tasmania, with the exception of migrations to uninhabited regions such as Iceland, which took place more peacefully. And even so, Camille Vallaux observes that even when they began by force, these migrations were usually followed by long-lasting peaceful infiltrations, in which trade replaces war and military advance gives way to peaceful and continuous settlement. Camille Vallaux also distinguishes spontaneous migrations, which are neither planned nor led by authorities, like those of the gold rush to California, and to Australia, where these movements were only possible due to the relative ease of maritime transport from Europe. Quite different from the enormous difficulties presented by land routes, such as crossing Alaska toward the interior of Canada. On the other hand, there are forced migrations, where the most evident example is the trafficking of enslaved Africans to the Americas, a mass displacement marked by maritime logic. Something similar happened, with less intensity, in the export of trade. African, however, marine caravans, rest, and Africa, in this case, the maritime sphere was functionally associated with the desert, because both serve as means of circulation between fixed centers, even though one is aquatic and the other is arid. The phenomenon he calls maritime caravans, which arrive in Jeddah, Muscat, or Zanzibar, are in this sense equivalent to the Saharan caravans between Kuka, Marzouk, and Tripoli. He also analyzes organized migrations, some aimed at political and commercial domination, like the Spaniards in the Americas, who sought to impose not only territorial control but also moral and religious authority. Others are focused solely on trade, like the Phoenician colonies spread across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, which rarely had imperial ambitions except for Carthage. And with the advance of modern colonialism, where most routes are maritime, it became impossible to ignore the extent of migrations by sea. And even though it's said that navigation only became important in the second half of the 19th century, that would be wrong. Camille Vallaux quotes Hatzel, whom you've seen on the channel. If not, I recommend checking it out, because it's the most basic foundation of geopolitics. But going back to Vallaux, he mentions how Hatzel reminds us that maritime journeys are very ancient, with Polynesians, Eskimos, and other peoples already exploring complex routes in seas with regular winds or connected by archipelagos. Under these conditions, even with primitive nautical techniques, it was possible to chart stable routes thanks to the weather patterns themselves. His analysis then turns to the faisceau de circulation, or bundles of circulation routes, which, unlike migratory routes, already form a true fabric in the oceans, with trade and passenger transport routes being even denser and more intertwined. In general, products paved the way before people. For a long time, regions like the Indian subcontinent were accessed by Europeans only through trading posts for spices and precious metals, with a few monopolist navigators before they began to receive a more regular flow of people. This was repeated on the African coast and on the recent routes of the North Pacific, where the movement of goods came much earlier and often long preceded the movement of people. The local resistance to Chinese or Japanese migration in California and British Columbia is an example of this. Products circulate, but people do not always do so. Although the sea seems free and open to navigation, maritime routes do not follow random lines. They seek to follow the curves of the great circles, but they also obey points of convergence at major ports of entry and exit. Steam navigation, by reducing dependence on the winds, has even allowed these routes to become more geometric and predictable. But even so, the routes are organized in bundles, which widen on the high seas and narrow again as they approach land. These circulation bundles, like those connecting Europe to North America, Brazil, Senegal, or the Atlantic islands, become dense maritime corridors of human and material presence. He talks about how Hatzel even proposed the concept of a destructive ecumene, suggesting that these areas of high maritime traffic density would also constitute a form of functional habitat. But Vallaux rejects this idea because, although these routes seem dense, they do not constitute permanent habitats. He prefers to keep them as route clusters because they are areas of intense transit, but set within vast empty stretches of ocean. They are not dwellings, but paths. Thus, Camille Vallaux's analysis reaffirms the huge difference between the sea as a passage territory and the sea as a living territory. Camille Vallaux then concludes his work with an analysis of the causes that structure the maritime routes and the route clusters in the ocean. He separates them into natural causes, such as winds, currents, and coastal landforms, and human causes, such as the concentration of naval infrastructure, trade, and port technology. He proposes a detailed examination of these routes both in the open sea and along the coastal routes, revealing how physical and human factors are interconnected to form networks in the open sea routes de large. Vallaux highlights how constant winds, ocean currents, and tides impose preferred directions for navigation, creating true natural channels through which ships are guided. In the North Atlantic, for example, three main zones stand out. The equatorial current, which by cutting across routes transversely does not create route clusters, the Gulf Stream, which concentrates routes between Europe and North America, and the northeast trade winds between Europe, Africa, and tropical America. On the other hand, calm zones, such as the region southeast of the Azores, are avoided even when they would be on the ideal geometric path, because the unstable winds there make navigation more difficult. And regarding coastal routes, straits and geographic bottlenecks like Gibraltar, the English Channel, the Suez Canal, Aden, and Singapore impose strong concentrations of traffic. These passages act like funnels, converging multiple routes coming from different parts of the world into narrow navigation corridors. Thus, the shape of the coast directly determines the form and intensity of circulation patterns. The human contribution to these circulation flows is mainly manifested through technical and economic development. Modern navigation concentrates infrastructure, capital, and technology in a few major ports such as New York, London, Hamburg, Rotterdam, or Antwerp, which attracts maritime traffic and structures traffic flows around these centers, which explains, for example, why the major French ports are in part bypassed by the main routes of the North Atlantic. Vallaux observes that these maritime flows do not have a uniform density. Some are dense and narrow, while others are dense. The most stable ones are those in temperate zones, where variable winds offset one another on outbound and return journeys. The example is the Europe-United States route, where the only significant variation is due to the seasonal movement of icebergs south of Newfoundland. In the Southern Hemisphere, the so-called Southern Hemisphere Circuit, which goes around America, Africa, and Tasmania, forms an even more regular path without major disturbances. Conversely, trade routes in the trade wind and monsoon zones, like those between Europe and the Cape or between India and Southeast Asia, are unstable. These areas are subject to seasonal and hemispheric fluctuations. The winds force ships to make large detours, with outbound and return routes often separated by thousands of kilometers. The example of European sailing ships going to the Cape of Good Hope illustrates this dispersion well. On the way there, they need to go around the southern hemisphere to the west. On the way back, they face difficulties in the northern hemisphere. This causes the corridors along these routes to be very wide and asymmetrical, sometimes extending more than 35 degrees of longitude. He also notes that the circulation corridors do not completely fill the oceanic domain. The zones that are outside them, but still part of the maritime ecumene, such as the whaling region in the Barents Sea, which, although outside the global circulation routes, has regular and specialized human activity. And remember that we are talking about the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, when whaling for oil was a fundamental part of the economy. In contrast to that, there are dense routes like between San Francisco and Hawaii that are not part of the ecumene because they do not support stable human communities. Meanwhile, the areas that are both outside the routes and the ecumenes, like the stretch of the Indian Ocean between the Seychelles, are the true oceanic voids from a human perspective. Finally, Vallaux presents the methodological plan of his thesis. His entire presentation will be organized within 4 major analytical categories: maritime ecumene, maritime migration, circulation corridors, and domination of the sea. These 4 pillars reveal the main aspects of human life in relation to the sea. He acknowledges that by classifying them separately, he runs the risk of artificially isolating them, but his goal is precisely to show how they are connected, interact, and balance each other. The challenge lies in capturing the relationship between natural facts, social data, and historical processes, as it is in this intersection that the true dynamism of maritime life in human societies is revealed. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed it. I know this is a denser, more niche video because it's academic, it's educational. Its focus is to provide this kind of more in-depth knowledge. After all, it's part of the Fathers of Geopolitics series, where I bring several videos about the classic authors of geopolitics. After all, everyone keeps talking about geopolitics here, geopolitics there. And practically nobody in those videos on those channels you watch actually knows where the term geopolitics comes from, where the methods come from, where the concepts come from. And here on the Geopolitica Mundial channel, by looking at the Fathers of Geopolitics, Mahan Mackinder, even Haushofer, Camille Vallaux, you can deeply understand what geopolitics is, without speculation, without guesswork, understand what geopolitics really is from the ground up. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this is the kind of video that's going to flop. Almost nobody will watch it, but it's the kind of video I insist on keeping here, even knowing it's going to be a disaster in terms of views. Alright? So consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, you give me that support so I can keep focusing on this kind of editorial direction, right? Where I have this academic freedom, this creative freedom to be more in-depth, more niche, because the focus is really on a more scientific approach. So by becoming a member, you guarantee that. And of course, you'll have access to several videos, exclusive videos for members, okay? Thank you all, take care, and see you in the next video.